The bell above the door chimed at exactly 11:45 on a Thursday night in 1953. Murphy heard it from behind the counter and didn't look up immediately. Late customers were an annoyance. They ordered coffee, sat too long, tipped badly, and left him mopping floors past midnight. He was already calculating how quickly he could turn the table when he finally raised his eyes and saw who had walked through his door. The diner went silent. Not the gradual quiet of a room losing interest in its own conversations. This was instantaneous. The kind of silence that happens when every person in a space processes the same information at exactly the same moment and arrives at the same conclusion. Something is wrong. Something is different. Something is about to happen that has never happened in this room before. Bumpy Johnson stood in the doorway of Murphy's diner like a man who had been there 1,000 times and owned the place on all of them. 6 feet of controlled precision in a perfectly tailored suit. His eyes swept the room with the unhurried attention of a man cataloging everything he sees and filing it for later use. He wasn't looking for trouble. He didn't need to look for trouble. Trouble, in Bumpy Johnson's experience, always found its way to him without any effort on his part. He walked to the counter and sat down. Murphy's hand moved toward the baseball bat he kept on the shelf below the register. Old habit. 20 years of running a diner in a neighborhood that didn't welcome ambiguity had trained his hands to reach for that bat before his brain had finished processing the threat. His fingers closed around the handle, and he felt, for a brief moment, the familiar comfort of wood and certainty. Then he looked at Bumpy Johnson's face, and the comfort went away. "You lost," Murphy said. It was the only thing he could think of, the only frame he had available for what was happening in his establishment. "This ain't your neighborhood." Bumpy looked at him with the patient attention of a man who has heard this particular sentence so many times it has ceased to carry any meaning. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he said. His voice was calm, conversational. The voice of a man discussing the weather or commenting on the quality of the coffee, not the voice of a man who had driven across town at 11:45 on a Thursday night to sit in a whites-only diner and order nothing. Not yet. To understand what happened next, you need to go back 3 weeks. You need to understand what Murphy did on a Tuesday evening in October, and why that Tuesday evening set in motion everything that was about to unfold in his diner on this Thursday night. You need to understand who Mary Washington was, and why her father's name was in a ledger that Bumpy Johnson kept in a locked drawer in his Harlem office, in a section labeled simply, "Debts Owed." Mary Washington was 17 years old. She worked 2 jobs. Days in a laundry on 116th Street, nights cleaning office buildings in Midtown Manhattan. She sent money home to her mother and 3 younger brothers every Friday without fail. She had been doing this since she was 15, since her father came back from Korea with pieces of shrapnel in his leg and a silence in his eyes that never fully left. She was the kind of young woman that the world produces occasionally and immediately sets about grinding down. The kind whose dignity is so complete and so effortless that it makes certain men deeply uncomfortable simply to be in the same room with it. Every Tuesday she stopped at Murphy's diner on her way home from the office buildings. It was the only diner open at that hour on her route. Murphy tolerated her the way he tolerated all the things in his life he couldn't fully control. He served her at the far end of the counter, away from his regular customers. He charged her double what he charged everyone else and called it a convenience fee when she asked. He watched her count her coins with the particular satisfaction of a man who enjoys watching people struggle with things he has deliberately made harder. On that Tuesday evening in October, Mary was short 3 cents. She had counted twice, then a third time, her fingers moving the nickels and dimes across the counter with the careful precision of someone for whom 3 cents was not an insignificant amount. She looked up at Murphy with the quiet dignity that was her default expression in situations designed to strip it away. "Please, Mr. Murphy, I'll bring the 3 cents tomorrow, I promise." Murphy's laugh was the kind that leaves a mark. "Promises don't pay bills, girl. No money, no service." Mary gathered her coins. Her dignity didn't crack. It never cracked. That was the thing about Mary Washington that made certain men hate her on sight. They could take her money, her time, her comfort, her access to the basic courtesies that other people took for granted. They could not take the thing she carried inside herself. It made them furious in a way they couldn't fully articulate. She stood up. She was tired, in the way that people are tired when they have been working since 6 in the morning, and it is now past 11 at night, and they are 17 years old, and the world has arranged itself specifically to make every simple thing harder than it needs to be. The tiredness showed for just a moment in the way she placed her hand on the counter to steady herself. Then her legs buckled, and Mary Washington collapsed onto the dirty floor of Murphy's diner. The diner had 11 customers that night. Every one of them saw it happen. Every one of them watched a 17-year-old girl lying unconscious on the linoleum and made the same calculation, arrived at the same conclusion, and did nothing. Murphy stepped over her, actually stepped over her body like it was an obstacle between him and where he needed to be. "Somebody get this out of my establishment," he said. Eventually, 2 of the customers helped carry Mary outside and left her on the sidewalk. Someone called an ambulance from a payphone down the street. She was taken to Harlem Hospital with exhaustion and low blood sugar. She recovered. She was back at work by Thursday. But before she went back to work on Wednesday morning, she told her father what had happened, and her father, James Washington, made a phone call, not to the police, not to a lawyer, to the one man in Harlem he knew had the ability and the willingness to make things right when official channels had already demonstrated, as they always demonstrated, their complete indifference to the suffering of people who looked like him and his daughter. James Washington called Bumpy Johnson, and when Bumpy answered and James told him what had happened, there was a silence on the line that James had heard before and that he understood completely. It wasn't the silence of indifference. It wasn't the silence of a man deciding whether to get involved. It was the silence of a man who has already decided and is simply calculating the most effective form of response. "I'll handle it," Bumpy said. He said it the way other men say, "I'll pick up milk on the way home," with the complete absence of drama that comes from absolute certainty about what you are going to do and complete confidence in your ability to do it. James Washington's name was in Bumpy Johnson's ledger for a reason. It was there because 3 years earlier, in a federal penitentiary in Georgia, where both men had found themselves at the same time for entirely different reasons, James Washington had put himself between Bumpy Johnson and a blade that a man from Brooklyn had been paid to use. He had done it without hesitation. He had spent 11 days in the prison infirmary as a result. He had never asked for anything in return, had never mentioned it again, had gone back to his life in Harlem when his time was served, and resumed being the quiet, dignified man he had always been. Bumpy Johnson did not forget things like that. Bumpy Johnson did not forget anything. 3 weeks. That was how long it took. Not because the plan was complicated. The plan was actually quite straightforward once Bumpy had assembled the information he needed. 3 weeks, because Bumpy Johnson believed, with the conviction of a man who had learned this lesson through long experience, that the most effective responses are never the fastest ones. They are the most thorough ones. The ones where every piece is in place before the first move is made. The ones where you already know how it ends before you walk through the door. He spent the first week learning about Murphy, not the Murphy that everyone in the neighborhood knew. The loud, red-faced man with the bat under the counter, and the sign on the door, and the long history of small cruelties toward anyone he judged to be outside his protected category. The other Murphy, the one that existed before this one, the one that had a different name in a different city and a very specific reason for the change. Tommy Caruso found it. Tommy had worked for Murphy for 8 years, handled the night deposits, knew where the keys to every lock in the building were kept, and had been quietly passing information to Bumpy's network for 6 of those 8 years. Not because he had been coerced. Because his daughter had been in trouble 3 years ago. The kind of trouble that in 1,950 inches New York had exactly one reliable solution if you weren't white and wealthy and connected. And Bumpy Johnson had provided that solution without being asked for anything in return. Tommy Caruso paid his debts. He found what Bumpy needed in a filing cabinet in the back office behind a false panel that Murphy believed was unknown to everyone except himself. Chicago, 1938. A warehouse fire that had killed 4 people and destroyed the savings of 11 immigrant families who had trusted the wrong man with their money. A man who had disappeared before the investigation concluded. A man who had reappeared in New York 3 years later with a new name, a new face, courtesy of a doctor who didn't ask questions, and a small amount of capital that had no obvious legitimate source. Murphy's real name was Michael Patrick Donnelly, and there were men in Chicago who had been looking for Michael Patrick Donnelly for 15 years. Not patiently, actively. Men who had lost family members in that fire. Men who had spent 15 years with nothing to show for it, except the specific, durable anger that comes from justice perpetually deferred. Bumpy made a phone call to Chicago. Then he made a call to Detective Raymond Williams of the Harlem precinct, who was also Mary Washington's cousin, and who had been building a case against Murphy's illegal gambling operation for the better part of a year, without quite having enough to move on. Then he spent a week organizing what he had into the kind of package that required only the correct moment for delivery. He chose Thursday night. He chose 11:45. He chose to go alone. Not because he needed to make a point about being alone, because the presence of his men would have changed the nature of what was about to happen, would have made it a display of force, a demonstration of numerical advantage. Bumpy wasn't interested in force. Force was for men who didn't have better tools available. He had better tools available. Murphy's hand was still on the bat when Bumpy placed his briefcase on the counter with the careful attention of a man setting down something valuable. The leather was good. The clasps were brass. It was the kind of briefcase that communicated, without saying anything, that its owner was accustomed to conducting serious business. "You threatening me in my own place?" Murphy said. His voice had found some of its usual authority, but the edges of it were soft in a way that the regulars at the counter noticed and filed away for later discussion. "I don't make threats," Bumpy said. "I make promises." The diner had gone completely still again. The customers who had been eating when Bumpy walked in had stopped eating. The ones who had been talking had stopped talking. Everyone was doing the calculation that people do in rooms where the normal rules have visibly suspended themselves. Everyone was deciding whether to stay or leave, and most of them were staying, because whatever was about to happen was clearly going to be something they would want to have witnessed. Murphy lifted the bat slightly. Not all the way, not a swing, a suggestion, a reminder of what was available if the conversation went in a direction he didn't want it to go. 3 large men at a corner table stood up, regulars, the kind of men Murphy called on when suggestions needed reinforcement. Bumpy looked at them with the interest of a man examining something mildly curious. Then he looked back at Murphy. "You sure you want to do this?" he said. The question was genuine. It was the kind of question you ask when you already know the answer but believe the other person deserves the opportunity to demonstrate that they know it too. Murphy did not know the answer. He lifted the bat the rest of the way. The swing came hard and fast and aimed at a point approximately where Bumpy's head had been a quarter of a second earlier. The wood hit the counter edge with a crack that made several customers flinch. Bumpy had not moved dramatically. He had simply been somewhere else when the bat arrived. "Murphy, Murphy, Murphy." He shook his head slowly. The tone was the tone of a disappointed teacher. "You really don't know who you're dealing with." The 3 men from the corner table moved forward. They were large men, experienced with violence, comfortable with the arithmetic of physical intimidation. They formed a semicircle. They were accustomed to this being the end of the conversation. The door chimed. 6 men walked in. They were dressed well, the kind of well that communicates that the clothes are not the most impressive thing about them. They arranged themselves around the room with the unhurried efficiency of people who have done this before and know exactly where to stand. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. The 3 men from the corner table looked at each other and performed a rapid recalculation. They sat back down. Murphy's bat was now resting on the counter beside him rather than in the air. His hands were on the wood, but the intention had gone out of them. "You know what your real problem is?" Bumpy said. He straightened his tie with the 2-fingered adjustment of a man who has just noticed it needs straightening. "You think respect comes from fear. You think power comes from a bat. You think that sign on your door gives you authority over who is and isn't a human being deserving of basic decency." Murphy said nothing. His eyes were on the briefcase. Bumpy placed his hand on the clasp. "You made a mistake 3 weeks ago, a significant one. You put your hands on someone under my protection. You let her collapse on your floor, and you stepped over her. And then you let other people carry her outside like she was something that needed to be removed rather than a person who needed help." Murphy's chin came up. "What happens in my diner is my business." "Was your business?" Bumpy corrected. He opened the briefcase. What came out of it first was a ledger, thick, well-worn, the kind of ledger that has been handled frequently and carefully. Murphy recognized it immediately. The color left his face in a single rapid departure, like a tide going out. "Tommy sends his regards," Bumpy said. The ledger contained 3 years of Murphy's illegal gambling operation, the names of the police officers on his payroll, the amounts and dates of their payments, the locations of the games, the names of the men who ran them. It was in the language of Detective Raymond Williams, who had been building his case for the better part of a year, everything he needed and then some. But the ledger was not the thing that made Murphy's legs uncertain beneath him. That came next. Bumpy reached into the briefcase again and produced a photograph. He held it so that only Murphy could see it. The image was old, slightly degraded, the kind of photograph that had been copied from a copy. But the face in it was recognizable. Murphy had spent 15 years being careful about photographs for exactly this reason. "Chicago," Bumpy said quietly. Just the one word. Murphy grabbed the counter. 1938, Bumpy continued. 4 people died in that fire, Murphy. Or should I say, Mr. Donnelly. 4 people, and the life savings of 11 families who had trusted you with money they couldn't afford to lose. The men who lost family members in that fire, they've been patient. I spoke to one of them last week. He was very interested to hear that Michael Patrick Donnelly had been running a diner in Harlem under a different name. Murphy's breathing had become audible. The customers closest to him were leaning away slightly, the instinctive movement of people who sense that the person next to them is about to do something unpredictable. "What do you want?" Murphy whispered. The room leaned forward. This was the question everyone had been waiting for. In these situations, in this world, this question always preceded the price, the number, the arrangement, the ongoing payment that transformed a moment of exposure into a permanent financial relationship. Bumpy surprised them. "I want you to understand something fundamental," he said. His voice had lost the conversational quality it had carried all evening. It carried something else now. Something that the customers would describe differently in different tellings of this story over the following years, but that all of them, in their various descriptions, would identify as the sound of a man speaking a truth he had worked out a long time ago and never needed to revise. There are 2 kinds of people in this world, those who protect the innocent and those who prey on them. You let a 17-year-old girl collapse on your floor because she was 3 cents short for a cup of coffee. You stepped over her like she was furniture. That is who you are. That is the specific kind of man you have been your entire life. Murphy opened his mouth. "I'm not finished," Bumpy said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You have a choice tonight. One choice. You can face what you did in Chicago. Detective Williams can process the arrest warrant he has been holding for your gambling operation. And I can make a phone call to a man in Chicago who has been waiting 15 years to hear that Michael Patrick Donnelly has been found." Or the word hung in the air like weather. Or you can become something different, starting tonight, in front of everyone in this room. Murphy stared at him. "What does that mean?" Bumpy nodded toward the door, toward the sign that had been on the window since Murphy opened the diner in 1946. The sign that had been the first thing Mary Washington saw every Tuesday night when she came for her coffee. The sign that told her, in 3 words, what the world thought she was worth. "Take it down," Bumpy said. "Tonight, in front of everyone, and then you're going to do something harder than taking down a sign. You're going to decide whether you want to spend the rest of your life being the man who stepped over that girl, or the man who chose differently when he had the chance." The diner was so quiet that the sound of the coffee percolating on the back burner was clearly audible. Murphy looked at the sign. He looked at his regulars, some of whom were watching him with the particular expression of men who have built their comfort on a certain understanding of how the world is ordered and are now watching that understanding tremble. He looked at the briefcase on his counter. He looked at Bumpy Johnson's face. Whatever he saw there was not what he had expected to see. He had expected to see triumph He had expected to see the satisfaction of a man winning. What he saw instead was something that confused him more deeply than any threat could have. He saw a man who was genuinely indifferent to whether Murphy chose correctly or not. A man who had prepared for both outcomes with equal thoroughness and who had no personal investment in which one Murphy selected. A man for whom this was not a victory to be savored but a problem to be solved. A man who had, if Murphy chose wrong, already arranged for the solution to be implemented. Murphy's hand closed around the sign. The metal was cold. He had touched it hundreds of times, had hung it himself when he opened the place, had replaced it once when the original cracked in a winter freeze. He had never thought about what it weighed before. It felt, now, like it weighed considerably more than it had any right to. He pulled it from the window. The scraping sound it made was the loudest thing in the room. He held it for a moment. Then he walked to the garbage can behind the counter and dropped it in. It landed with a hollow clang that several customers would remember for the rest of their lives. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Then the door opened again, and Mary Washington walked in. She looked exactly as she had 3 weeks ago, tired in the specific way of someone who has been working since 6 in the morning. 17 years old, with the dignity of someone 3 times that age. She stood in the doorway of Murphy's diner and looked at the window where the sign had been, and at Murphy and at Bumpy Johnson, and at the briefcase on the counter. "Miss Washington," Bumpy said formally, "would you like a cup of coffee?" Mary looked around the diner, at Murphy, who couldn't meet her eyes, at the spot on the floor where she had fallen 3 weeks ago, at the customers who had watched her collapse and done nothing, and who were now watching her with expressions that ranged from shame to something that looked almost like hope. "That depends," she said quietly. "Am I welcome here?" The question went to Murphy. Everyone understood that. It was the only question that mattered, and he was the only person in the room who could answer it. Murphy's throat worked. He had spent 40 years being a specific kind of man, and he was being asked, in this moment, to be a different kind, and the distance between the two felt enormous in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had expected this to feel like defeat. It felt like something else, something he didn't have a word for yet. "Miss Washington," he said. His voice was not steady, but it was present. "I owe you an apology. What happened 3 weeks ago was wrong. You deserved better. You deserved basic human decency, and I failed to provide it." Mary said nothing. She waited. "Your coffee is free tonight," Murphy continued, "and every night, for as long as you want it." He reached into the register and placed $3 on the counter in front of her. More than she made in a day. "This is for what happened. It's not enough. It'll never be enough. But it's what I have." Mary looked at the money, at Murphy's outstretched hand, at Bumpy Johnson, who was watching with the expression of a man observing an outcome he considered possible but had not assumed. She walked to the counter. She sat on the stool, the same stool she had been sitting on 3 weeks ago when her legs gave out beneath her. "I'll take that coffee," she said. Murphy's hands shook as he poured. The cup rattled against the saucer. Coffee sloshed over the edge. He had served 10,000 cups of coffee in this diner, but his hands had never shaken before, and they were shaking now. He placed the cup in front of her. Steam rose between them. Mary lifted the cup and took a sip. "It's good," she said. 2 words, The simplest possible sentence, and something in Murphy cracked open that had been sealed shut for 40 years. Something he hadn't known was sealed. The customers who were watching said later, in their various retellings, that they had never seen anything like it. A man of Murphy's particular type, a man who had built his entire identity on hardness and certainty and the refusal to acknowledge the humanity of people he had decided were beneath him, sitting down on a stool behind his own counter, with tears running down his face. Outside, a crowd had gathered. Word had moved through the neighborhood with the speed that important information always moved in communities where the informal networks are better maintained than the official ones. People pressed against the window looking in. Some had come expecting violence. Some had come expecting to see Bumpy Johnson demonstrate once again the specific mathematics of consequence in the world he operated in. What they saw instead was something none of them had expected. Something that most of them would identify in the years that followed as the strangest and most affecting thing they had ever witnessed in a neighborhood that had provided them with considerable competition in that category. They saw a man choosing to be different. Bumpy picked up his briefcase. He closed the clasps with the same careful attention he had opened them with. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Murphy behind the counter, and at Mary Washington on her stool, and at the spot on the floor where the sign had been, and at the crowd outside pressing their faces against the glass. "You know what your real problem was?" he said to Murphy, not unkindly, with the tone of a man completing an analysis he had been conducting for some time. "You confused authority with respect. You thought that sign gave you power over people. But real power isn't about what you can deny. It's about what you can build." He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. "Detective Williams will be by next week," he said. "About the gambling operation. I'd suggest having your books in order and being prepared to cooperate fully. The Chicago matter I'll consider settled, provided nothing like this happens again. Not to Mary, not to anyone." He pushed the door open. "Murphy," he said without turning back, "she comes in every Tuesday. Make sure the coffee is hot." The bell above the door chimed as he stepped out into the Harlem night. 6 months later, Murphy's Diner was a different place. Not different in the way that places are different after renovations, after new paint and new furniture, and the physical erasure of what came before. Different in the way that places are different when the people in them have changed. The counter was the same counter. The stools were the same stools. The coffee was made in the same percolator. But the room had a different quality to it. The kind of quality that spaces acquire when something true has happened in them, and the truth has been allowed to take root. Murphy opened the doors at 6 every morning and greeted every customer himself, not because he was required to, because he had discovered, in the weeks following that Thursday night, that the specific sourness that had lived in his chest for most of his adult life was diminishing, slowly, in direct proportion to the degree to which he chose to treat the people who walked through his door as what they were. The regulars who had built their comfort on the old arrangement stopped coming. He didn't miss them. New customers came, people from the neighborhood who had never been inside because of what the window said. Construction workers and college students, musicians and seamstresses, elderly men who played chess, and young women who studied for exams. The diner that had survived on the loyalty of the comfortable became something that thrived on the custom of everyone. Mary Washington came every Tuesday. She brought her textbooks. Murphy had arranged with someone who knew someone connected to the community college to have her tuition covered anonymously. He didn't tell her. He didn't think he had earned the right to tell her. He had earned, at most, the right to make the coffee hot and the counter clean and the welcome genuine. Tommy Caruso stayed on. He had been afraid in the immediate aftermath of that Thursday night that his role in what had happened would cost him his position. Murphy had said nothing about it. Had, in fact, given Tommy a raise the following week with the explanation that reliable men were hard to find and he intended to keep the ones he had. Tommy understood what was being said. He kept coming in at 6 and leaving at 3 and never mentioned any of it again. Detective Williams processed the gambling charges with the particular efficiency of a man who has been waiting to process them for a long time. The penalties were significant but survivable. Murphy paid them. He considered them fair. Chicago remained quiet. The man Bumpy had spoken to on the phone had listened and made his own calculations. The calculations had apparently come out in Murphy's favor, at least provisionally. Some debts, Bumpy had said during that phone call, can be paid in ways other than money. Sometimes a man paying forward what he owes is more valuable than a man paying back what he took. Bumpy Johnson never came back to Murphy's diner. Not because something had gone wrong, because nothing had gone wrong. Because the outcome had been what it needed to be, and his presence after that was unnecessary, and he had other things requiring his attention. The briefcase, with its ledger and its photograph, and its carefully assembled documentation of everything Murphy had been and everything he had done, was returned to the locked drawer in the Harlem office, not destroyed. Filed. Because Bumpy Johnson believed in documentation the way other men believed in religion. Because the truth, carefully preserved, was the most durable instrument of justice available in a world where official justice was so reliably absent. Years later, when Mary Washington was Dr. Mary Washington, the first black female physician in the neighborhood, and when Murphy's Diner had been written up in 3 national magazines as an example of something that people in 1953 had believed was impossible, a reporter from the Amsterdam News asked Murphy what had changed him, what had made that night different from any other night, what had made him reach for the sign instead of the bat. Murphy thought about it for a long time. He was an old man by then, and old men have the particular advantage of having had enough time to figure out what actually happened versus what they thought was happening at the time. I looked at his face, Murphy said finally. Not when he was talking. After, when he was walking out the door, and I realized he didn't need anything from me. He had already arranged for everything that needed to happen. If I made the wrong choice, there were consequences ready. If I made the right one, there were different consequences. Either way, he'd already handled it. The only question was what kind of man I wanted to be when it was over. He was quiet for a moment. I'd been the wrong kind for a long time. It seemed like the night to try something different. The reporter asked if he had ever seen Bumpy Johnson again. No, Murphy said, but I never needed to. He left something in this room that night that didn't go away when he did. The reporter asked what that was. Murphy looked around his diner, at the mixed faces over the coffee cups and the breakfast plates, at the old chess players and the young students, at the counter, where a girl had collapsed 20 years ago, and where now people sat together without anyone calculating who belonged and who didn't. The understanding, Murphy said, that you always had a choice, that the thing you thought was just the way it was actually just the choice you kept making, and that you could stop making it any time you decided to. He refilled the reporter's coffee without being asked. Turns out it's never too late to stop making the wrong choice, he said. That's the thing nobody tells you. It's never too late. You just have to be willing to take the sign down. Outside on the street, Harlem moved through its morning. The neighborhood that had produced Bumpy Johnson and James Washington and Mary Washington and all the others who had learned through the specific education of being who they were in the time and place they were it. That dignity was not something the world gave you. It was something you carried, something you protected, something you defended, quietly, strategically, with patience and intelligence, and the absolute refusal to let anyone convince you that what was in the briefcase was less important than what was in the bat. The coffee was hot. The door was open. The window was clean. And on the shelf below the register, gathering dust in the slow accumulation of unused years, a baseball bat that Murphy had decided on a Thursday night in 1953 he would never need to reach for again.